counselor.
Exciting speeches.
By design.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
All right.
That was a
I'm
compliment.
sure you took
Yeah, I did.
copious notes for me.
I did not.
Actually don't.
Are we at
Quorum, do we? I'm gonna. Oh, Councilwoman's here.
I'll wait for my hot flash to even it out. Yeah. A swimsuit and a fur coat. That would be the appropriate. I've been sleeping in the basement where it's way colder, and even then, this is. Yeah, I know. Are we ready?
Okay.
Hi.
So I think we were ready to get started.
You were there, you're now here.
I'll be over here from now on.
Okay.
Yes. Half
Just
presenter
saying.
is over there. Yeah.
I was like, where is he?
All right. So with that, it's 10:33, and just as a reminder to counselors to please keep your computers completely off and to stay muted on Zoom. We'll just be using the gooseneck mics today. So with that, I will go ahead and start our recording, and we'll have a short introduction video.
Recording in progress.
For as long as people have called this place home, they've been welcomed with clean air, clean water, and an abundance of nature. As time went on, people saw the need to balance how we build cities with how we protect farms and forests. That's why across Greater Portland, in 24 cities and 3 counties, there's one metro government that brings us all together to maintain that vital balance, to provide services across cities and counties, to create a better future together. Hello, we're Metro. We plan for housing, jobs, and safe transportation. We protect land, air, and water by managing garbage and recycling. We support arts and culture by overseeing local venues to keep the economy growing. And we connect people to nature across 17,000 acres of parks and trails and at the Oregon Zoo. Metro is all of us working together, connecting how we live today with how we plan for the future. Hello, we're Metro, and so are you.
Metro work session for September 12th, 2023 to order. We have a quorum. Connor, will you please call the roll?
Yes, thank you, President Peterson. Councilor Lewis.
Present.
Councilor Nolan.
Present, but my computer doesn't seem to know it. So if I could get a little tech help.
Yes, in just a moment.
Thanks.
Councilor Wong.
Present.
Councilor Rosenthal.
Present.
Councilor Gonzalez.
President, good morning.
Good morning. Councilor Simpson.
Present.
And President Peterson.
Here, thanks. We will play a safety video for our in-person attendees now. Thanks.
I'm Micah Reese, and I'm the dive safety officer here at the Oregon Zoo, and safety is a big part of my job. Some of the things we consider here is diver safety. I'm out here at the Oregon Zoo, and you're at the Metro Regional Center. The council chamber is located on the 3rd floor of this building. In the event of fire or fire alarm, please exit through the door in the northeast corner of the room, go down the steps to the 2nd floor, and exit through the main entrance by the reception desk and gather in the courtyard outside the entrance. In the event of a medical or fire emergency, please call 911 and notify the security agent at the front desk. The nearest defibrillator is mounted on the steps leading from the reception desk down to Grand Avenue. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. We have we've got 2 agenda items today. We have our 2023 Regional Transportation Plan process update and feedback on draft policies and implementation. And we have 3 staff that'll be coming forward to present. Come on forward. You're the next contestant. No. Catherine Charlo, our Planning, Development, and Research Director, Tom Kloster, the Regional Planning Manager, and Kim Ellis, our Regional Transportation Plan Manager, discuss the takeaways from the public comment period on the 2023 RTP and 2023 High Capacity Transit Plan. Take it away, Catherine.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Councilor President Peterson and councilors. We really appreciate being here today to do a couple of things, to summarize for you what we heard in the last public comment session for the RTP, which just closed at the end of August, and pull out some major themes for you, and start to talk about the walk between here and the end of November, which is when our federally mandated approval would need to take place in order to hit the December 6th federal deadline. So we'd like to do that. We've pulled out, as I say, some major themes and would like to talk through some early staff thoughts on recommendations that we will make to our committees and get your input on those themes to help inform those recommendations moving forward. With me today are Tom Kloster, Regional Planning Manager, and Kim Ellis, the Project Manager for the RTP update. Kim is going to walk through the themes and the comment summary, but before that, I'd like to, if we could have the next slide, please. Next slide. Great. I'd like to just talk about outcomes for today. I mentioned the timeline. Also important is the decision process. It's a process that includes both JPACT and the Metro Council, and it is critically important that we get from here to there, since our federal funding is reliant on having an RTP in place. We'll remind you of the engagement that has taken place already, and we'll summarize key policy areas that still need work. Some of that work can happen between now and the end of the year and the approval, and some of that work will happen as part of implementation moving forward with this RTP. And then some of what we've learned from this RTP will be lessons that we take forward into developing the next RTP, which essentially starts next year and will be completed in 2028. So it is an ongoing process. It's a learning process. What you'll see today reflects truly 10 years of work and 10 years of learning. And I think we're in a good place to move forward, and we appreciate any and all comments and engagement from you to do that. Next slide, please. You've seen this timeline a lot. As you all know well by now, the RTP includes both policies that guide transportation planning in the region and projects, a list of those projects that are submitted by our partners and that are eligible to receive federal and state transportation funding. So we'll be talking about both of those today. And in fact, in our council session where you heard testimony on the RTP, there was a lot of emphasis on the policies and the importance of those policies, both moving forward to implement this RTP and moving forward to frame the next one up. I do want to share a couple of specifics with you, just to ground us in what this process has included over the last 18 months. Sometimes it can feel like we just arrived here, but we, as the Metro Councilor and JPACT, have been convening the RTP process for almost 2 years. And that process has included multiple council work sessions, joint workshops with JPACT, staff briefings, a lot of partnership and engagement with community-based organizations to understand priorities and help take what we hear about those priorities to inform the guidance we give our local partners as they submit projects. We've done online surveys, other comment opportunities, and we've heard a lot from our local, state, and regional partners. We hear that in the JPACT setting, and we've heard it here, and we've heard it in project-based conversations. We've also heard from local and state non-transportation partners. We've heard from tribes, we've heard from business associations, and many others throughout the process. As part of your dual MPO function, your federally designated and state designated function, you have been working with JPACT on the approval process, and they've been going through the same approval process. And then MPAC will also submit a recommendation to the council before your final action. And I guess just a note on what you will hear in terms of these themes, just to ground that a little bit. I want to thank you for your work and engagement on this effort. It's a long, technical and challenging effort. You have a front seat into how complicated it is and how demanding it is, not just to go through the technical work, but to balance the needs and desires of a very diverse region. Our partners don't all have the same ideas as we as a regional council have. They don't all have the same priorities, and we've heard all of that, and then also you have, at every step of the way, helped us take that community input and try to inform and shape that. You set policies as council to advance our regional goals of safety, mobility, equity, climate, and economy. And as the NPO convener, you've invited our partners to submit projects that reflect those goals and serve their local needs. The resulting policies, as I think we again heard in our RTP testimony earlier in August, are well received and reflect those policies very strongly. The project mix reflects years of work and process, and it reflects very strongly local priorities in the context of those policies, and you will hear that today. And then finally, just a word on the November 30th approval itself. Without an approved RTP in place, we will not be eligible to receive funding, federal funding, and some state funding for transportation. The timeline is tight. The November 30th approval leads to quite a bit of work that needs to happen before the December 6th federal deadline. So we are here to get your concerns, to work very hard between now and the end of the year to reflect those concerns, to make staff recommendations, and move those recommendations forward, either, as I say, in the context of this RTP, or moving forward into implementation or developing the next. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Kim to talk about some of the specifics of what we've heard. And then we'll remain here for questions and discussion, especially near the end of Kim's presentation as we talk through the specific themes. So thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm excited to be here today and building off of what Catherine just expressed. This slide shows all of that engagement that she described that we've been doing throughout the process, and the final comment period that closed in August built on all of these touch points. Next slide, please. So we heard through a variety of ways from many people across the region. We had an online survey. More than 600 participants expressed their views about the new policies that are in the plan, the projects that are being recommended, and then also shared their thoughts about what they would like to see as we go forward with implementation. We also had an online comment form that folks around the region used to submit very specific comments and recommended changes to the public review draft document. We received emails, letters from community organizations, advocacy groups, our local state partners. We also convened 2 consultation meetings with federal, state, natural resource agencies, as well as tribes. We had continued conversations. We've been working with Katie McDonald, Metro's tribal liaison, to engage tribes in this work. And then we also had the public hearing that Catherine noted, where you received testimony from 13 different community members representing a range of different organizations. We do now have a draft public comment report that I will send out to you after today's work session. recommendation that is available online that documents all of this, every piece that was submitted, whether it was a letter, email, and staff are working to summarize it further and begin developing our staff recommendations. Next slide, please. And as part of that, I would like to just highlight these themes that we heard through this comment period. These will look familiar to you. These are similar themes to what we've been hearing all throughout the process. There's a recognition that our region is growing and changing, that we have a lot of diverse transportation needs, as Catherine said. There's a desire to have more transit, more gaps in walking and biking completed than what we have currently proposed in the plan. And there's safety and climate continue to rise as concerns from the folks that provided feedback through this process. And so for us, as we're looking to finalize the draft RTP and looking forward to beginning to implement it next year, what can we do to continue to better address investing more in those areas and better addressing safety and climate? We also heard strong feedback from partners, local partners, but also community-based organizations about making sure that we're being accountable to the policies that are in the plan. As Catherine said, there's strong support for the adopted policies, but how are we ensuring that as we go forward, that those policies are being implemented in the way that they are intended, and that we continue to work towards having our investment priorities align with those policies. In addition, we had a lot of feedback, project-specific feedback that we're also accounting for in our summary of comments and developing our staff recommendations. Comments expressing support for particular projects, comments that are asking for certain projects to be advanced because they address some of these areas that we heard people would like to see more of. And in addition, concerns raised about the larger major projects that are continued to undergo evaluation and planning work in our region. And so all of this, we will be continuing to build on your past direction and feedback throughout this process, but also other processes as we're developing our recommendations on moving forward. And I would like to say we are also working directly with the local agencies and other project partners on the project-specific feedback as we develop those recommendations. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom really quickly for him to just give a sort of a process overview, and then I'll start to walk through the key topics that we wanted to share with council today.
Thanks, Kim. Good morning, President Peterson, members of the council. Again, Tom Kloster for the record. Again, a couple slides here on process. We're really in the home stretch for this retail transportation plan, and there's a lot of key dates coming up here. I'll just mention that on this slide, there's a couple of buckets that we are sorting all of these comments we're getting into. The large bucket is really things that we're going to call consent items. We propose those as items that are just simply approved as a batch. These are typically less substantive actions. There's going to be hundreds of these edits to make it a better plan. There's a smaller subset that are really policy discussions that we've really been having since last fall at your workshops that still need more time. They're going to need more time after this RTP update. We want to make sure we have time to walk through those with policymakers, keep us moving in the right direction on things like climate, as an example. So upcoming, we've got council discussions proposed on October 10th and November 7th. I mentioned that because you'll see at the bottom of this chart, there's a hearing to do the first reading of the ordinance. That's actually just a hearing. We don't propose to have council discussion at that meeting. That'll be a chance to listen and then come back again on October 10th and the 7th of November to talk more about the council's direction on this RTP. We've also got, you can see on the calendar there, we've got MPAC making their recommendation to council in mid or late October, and then JPAC making their recommendation to council in late or mid November. In both cases, these are recommendations that we'll bring forward to you in November at your November 30th meeting and ask you to consider the two recommendations and to consider taking action on the RTP. So it's a tight timeline. As Catherine pointed out, we must adopt otherwise we lapse the plan. Our goal is to make sure that we get everything lined up and that everybody feels like this is a good plan and ready to be adopted by that time. And we'll go to the next slide. And so these are the 5 areas that Kim talked about earlier. We're going to actually walk through these today and give you a chance to give us feedback on these as well, give you a preview of where we're going as staff and making our recommendations on how to address these major topics that have emerged. These are topics that are coming from public comment. These are the predominant areas of focus in the public comments we're receiving from folks who weighed in. We'll be now taking these to the 2 technical committees, TPAC and MTAC, and making our recommendations to them as staff. This is where your feedback is helpful for us today to make sure that we're still aligned with the larger goals that you set out at the workshops last summer with JPACT, and that we can consider your feedback as we write these up. These are specific amendments to the draft RTP that was released, so it's literally new language being proposed to respond to public comments. Again, Kim will walk through these one by one. As we move ahead here, both those committees, TPAC and MTAC, will make recommendations to JPACT and MPAC. Those are committees that all but President Peterson serve on, and so you'll actually be acting on these as committee members at those 2 forums, at MPAC and JPAC coming up. So that's why it's important for us to be talking about this today and preparing you for those discussions. We'll have a similar discussion with those committees shortly here, next week with JPAC, I believe next week, and soon after with MPAC. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Kim to talk through these different topic areas. And again, we'll just pause on each one to make sure we're getting your feedback today with any questions you have or suggestions you have on our direction that we're proposing to take.
Great, thanks. Next slide. So we'll start with the investment emphasis. And as I said, under the key themes, there are concerns about the significant investment in the thruway system and less investment relative to transit, walking and biking, and other parts of the system. And there are some recommendations that staff are contemplating about these. One, I would just want to say that those 3 projects have been undergoing planning for a very long time in this region, and there have been a lot of other actions that have been taken at the regional level, state legislative action for those as well. And so the types of project list adjustments that staff are looking to is to look for opportunities to further advance some of those walking and biking projects and transit projects. We're working directly with the agency, the project sponsors on some of those. Some examples, though, of what we've also begun thinking about as part of our recommendation is asking ODOT to unbundle some of their projects. They have $1.2 billion worth of projects that are not place specific, that are for the urban arterials in our system, and that is a path for being able to highlight the types of investments that they would be making to that part of the system, which would get at investments that will help transit move more efficiently, but also completing those gaps in the system. The Oregon Transportation Commission has also adopted STIP, the State Transportation Improvement Program, that identifies a number of different projects for those arterials as well. And that's another area of recommendation that we're contemplating, to have those projects reflected as a project in the regional transportation plan. They are not currently part of it. This would allow us to be able to evaluate them as part of the overall package. We are also looking at recommendations around future work, in advance of the next update to the regional transportation plan. These could be similar, but building on what we did in this process, where we provided a policy framework and guidance for project sponsors, but to do more of that work earlier in the process, leading to the call for projects. Also potentially process changes for how we go about prioritizing investments, how we're engaging community in advance of the call for projects, and other such types of recommendations. So things, for each of these topics, we're trying to identify things that could happen now as part of this finalizing the plan for your consideration along with JPAC, but also thinking about what are some changes that we can identify in Chapter 8 of the RTP for us to be working towards in advance of the next update to the Regional Transportation Plan. Next slide. This policy topic is specifically around how will the pricing policy that was developed with your feedback and input and direction, as well as JPAC, be followed as those three big projects continue moving forward in their NEPA processes. Each of those projects, Council and JPAC have adopted conditions of approval for each of the previous steps that have been approved for those efforts, and ensuring that as that work continues, that ODOT is following through on the commitments that they made as part of the adoption actions for those projects. So those recommendations, there are specific requests by our partners to identify that as projects come forward for future MTIP amendments, that we're building into that amendment process, a review of how those commitments are being followed and where they are within that set of commitments. Next slide. The third topic is really focused on what are we doing as a region between now and the next update to bring more funding to transportation in the region. We've heard through comments, and there's significant work that has been completed in the past around the JPAC table as they develop their work plan for next year, that work could continue. There were recommendations in the comment period around setting up a subcommittee or some process by which that there is active work happening leading up to the 2025 legislative session and participating in some of the state level funding discussions in advance of that session. Also continuing to look for federal funding opportunities to fund these needed investments. That's a key piece of the high capacity transit strategy. It's laying out a pipeline for those future transit investments, but there are many other funding opportunities related to climate, related to safety that the region is already working on and can continue to advance to bring more revenue to fund more of the projects that are priorities all across the region. And then recognizing that there are other conversations or strategies that can also be pursued at the regional level, at the local level, to really ensure that we're doing everything possible to bring different revenue sources to the region to advance these priorities. Next slide. The fourth topic is around the climate tools and analysis. We did hear a lot of concerns about some of the assumptions that we were using in our analysis. We have followed the state law in doing what we've done, so I just want to be clear about that. But we do think that there are opportunities to further evaluate some of the areas that there are concerns that the state assumptions may be a little rosier than what is happening currently or the trends in which they are that we're experiencing around the vehicle fleet mix as well as the transition to electrification in the region and others. So the staff recommendations that we're contemplating are looking for opportunities to further evaluate and document where those assumptions are on track, where they are not on track, and be really clear about what actions the state needs to continue to work towards, and then what can our region at the regional level, but also at the local level, do to really continue to improve on addressing the impact on climate, and then look for opportunities as we are making future decisions to continue to improve our tools to evaluate the potential climate impacts, but also to have that inform policy and investment decisions as we go forward. Next slide. And the last topic is is highlighted because our local partners have expressed concern. There's been broad support for the updated mobility policy, which has been a joint effort of ODOT and Metro since 2019, and the shift that it is making from a focus on vehicle congestion to one that's prioritizing all of these different outcomes for all the different ways that people are traveling to ensure that it's accessible, efficient, equitable, safe, reliable, and that there are travel options. The concerns that have been raised by our local partners has really been focused on the implementation, the timing of it, and that there is additional work for us to do to support that local implementation. And so the recommendations that staff will be making are mapping out what that future work is, that it will be coordinated with our state partners as they continue to work to implement new state transportation planning rule requirements of our local partners. This mobility policy really positions our region and our local partners to meet those new state rules, and we need to work together with our state partners as we develop the approaches and guidance for how to measure certain things, particularly for local comprehensive plan amendments. We'll need to update our regional transportation functional plan, and that actually is the vehicle for directing how local governments and when local governments will implement the mobility policy. It's not upon adoption of the regional transportation plan. So just recognizing there's more work to do to implement it, and a commitment for us to follow through and do that work between now and the next update. So next slide. So I'm going to turn it back to Catherine here. That was a preview of a very thick, I just want to highlight, this document are all the comments and staff recommendations that we've been working on that we will be bringing forward to you.
Thank you, Kim. What we would like to do now is tee up the proposed direction that you all could give to us as staff as we work through the recommendations. But we also want to really invite discussion. This was just our first take to help shape the way you might want to think about us working on these recommendations. We can also toggle back after I walk through this to the slide that lists the 5 areas, if that would be helpful to people as well. But as we thought about how you all, at the end of this process, can organize what you want to tell us to think about, we have this proposal. And again, this is purely a straw person proposal, but we would propose that you direct us to continue to produce draft recommendations reflecting the things that Kim has talked about and other questions and comments that come up in the discussion. Really focusing on maximizing the potential of this current RTP to advance climate and safety goals, given where we are in the process. Happy to have an honest discussion about that. And then equally important, setting the stage for future work, both implementing this RTP through the MTIP and through implementation of various policy components, and setting the stage for a 2028 RTP that continues to evolve with the region and continues to reflect a stronger and stronger focus on the mobility, safety, climate, equity, and economy goals that you all have set. We suggest you tell us to present these recommendations to TPAC and MTAC to inform their discussions. You will undoubtedly hear questions and comments from them. At that point, the recommendations would become theirs, going to JPAC and MPAC. And then other things that come out of this discussion as well. Of course, there's plenty of room for that. So that's our proposal to you, and I think what we might want to do is go back to the slide that lists the 5 areas and just have Council President Peterson open up a discussion to hear what's on your minds about this. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. There's a lot here. One thing I want to just start off by saying is thank you for continuing the best practices of our engagement with this document, this amazing thing. I remember being on the other side of an RTP as an advocate, and you started this practice, and it does present the opportunity for people to be able to track that their comments are being looked at and considered, and how they were considered and where they were actually changed, had made changes. It changes the tenor of the conversation when you can actually understand what was proposed, why it was proposed, why the advice was taken or not taken, and if it made a difference where. It's just changes the whole tenor of the conversation. So I just want to point out that I still consider it one of the best practices ever in terms of being able to participate. So I would like to start this conversation by going to our JPAC counselors first for observations, and then we'll run through the rest of the counselors. I think it's just important to hear, because there is such a larger conversation that they're a part of, to give more context. So Counselor Gonzalez, would you like to start us out as JPAC Chair?
Thank you so much, President Peterson. Yes, I would love to. I would love to. First, I have to acknowledge the amazing hard work of Catherine and her team. Really has been a huge pleasure going through this process. And I will acknowledge that as a JPAC chair, I've also had the opportunity to have, in-depth conversations with most counselors. And so I do have a lot of the feedback and items I have are kind of a collection of those conversations. So I want to make sure that I'm not, kind of stealing the thunder from others and giving as much opportunity for the council to share. We have, as JPAC counselors, dedicated some time for diving into some of the chapters as well, and pass some feedback to staff about areas we think that the policy could improve pertaining to safety, climate, innovation, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more in general. I think one of the things that has really resonated in this process through the public comment period, and also acknowledging that there are some other really significant parallel processes happening with the RTP, is trying to line up what sometimes feels like incongruences with the public and what the long range planning, what the long range planning policy and the language says about things that we should be doing, things that we could be doing, and reconciling it with that some things are already underway. So one of the things that we've been trying to work on in our conversations and prep for JPAC, and also through this process is finding a way for the public to see a reflection of learning from the 2018 RTP into this RTP, and also using this as a tool and the policy guiding document that we want it to be for implementation. There have been questions from counselors, from community members, stakeholders, asking us to evaluate the success of the 2018 RTP as we go forward today as a measuring stick for the 2023 RTP, and it's been a helpful kind of framing for us to look at the work. I think that in terms of the 1 through 5 that we see here, I see a really strong reflection from my conversations with folks. I think what feels the most pressing as we close this project comment period is trying to understand with our local jurisdictions how we can shift our prioritization list for projects to help climate and safety accelerate our progress on those goals. I think we continue to be really focused on the development of pricing and tolling, not only in the major projects, but also projects that could be underway in the next 10 years as well. New projects and new corridors that we're actively involved in planning and studying, and trying to learn from some of the lessons that we have there. So yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that we can do like more of a roundtable and continuing to go around and round. But I feel like I want to give Counselor Lewis and Counselor Simpson also some opportunity to talk about this, but I think that from what you're sharing, staff, I think it reflects really strongly what we've heard, and I want us to continue working on this in the timeline that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Lewis.
Sure, thank you so much. Catherine, at the beginning of your remarks, you thanked us for going down into the rabbit holes and into the weeds with you. And I want to flip that on its head and actually thank you for coming with us as council. Very few of the decisions that we contemplate at this table our constituents care about as much as the implications of what is going to happen out of this RTP. So despite the fact that we're in rabbit holes and we're deep in the weeds, it is the work that we all signed up for. So I first want to really give a shout out to Tom for his work taking direction kind of early, mid in this process to develop the arterial policy, working with ODOT to basically put policy in place that had never been agreed upon as policy. I think it's a little early to take the victory lap because we're not adopting it today, but I think you've come to a place where the chapter of work is closed, and want to thank you and the rest of the team for that. It cannot have been pleasant to have to do that. And I just also want to acknowledge that I was a cheerleader, but the visionary for how that came to be was Bob Stacy. So there, that was a moment. We're not there on tolling with this document. The number one thing I hear, I cannot go to the coffee shop, I cannot go to the pool, I cannot go to the grocery store without getting complaints about tolling, and how ODOT's process is so focused on getting from point A to point B to the detriment of the community I represent, that they are still not hearing my communities. So I am looking for a realistic check on tolling. I'm looking for a revision that includes language that includes the positives that tolling could afford, but also the harms that it will create if it continues to roll out in the way that ODOT is talking about it. And that frankly, we need to have language that programs that roll out up to our values. I would also see a couple of change. One, I think we as the region need to take electrification and charging into our work plan. I think we need to both plan and also contemplate charging as a public good, a public enterprise. I think we need to continue to talk about accessibility, but also real usefulness. And then also in the context of focusing on urban arterials, I'm really glad that ODOT has 1.2 billion, but it's a pot of funds, it's not a plan. How can we ask for them to actually plan with us and not for us? Finally, we've got to make sure that when we're talking about safety, we understand the difference between the safety statistics of traffic violence and the more prevalent feeling of safety or lack of safety that prevents people from being out on the street or taking public transportation. And it's not always a fear of vehicles, sometimes it's a fear of other people. That is going to bring us into enforcement and again, policies around consequences. I look forward to further reflecting on project lists and specific projects in my district. But I think I'd like to end just with a more general question. The only projects that I really heard surface in this conversation were the highway projects. And I guess I would ask for you to spend a little bit more time clarifying freeway projects. Are these only the 3 projects that we've been working on for 8 years now? Or is there a list of projects on freeways that is on top of what was contemplated starting back in 2016? That's a question.
Counselor, would you like us to ask that
Yes,
now?
please.
I want to clarify the question. When you say clarify the projects, do you mean the ones we've heard the most about in the public comment section?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to Kim for that.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you for the question, Councilor Lewis. So the majority of the feedback have been on the big three projects. There are other throughway projects that are in the draft plan. We've heard less about them specifically, but as I said, the feedback has been the share of investment that's going into the throughway system relative to other parts of the system overall has also been a concern. So there's about $1 billion worth of other throughway investments in addition to those three big projects that are addressing auxiliary lanes, braided ramps, truck climbing lanes on other parts of I-5 and I-205 and Highway 217.
Kim, could I add to that comment, back to your comment earlier, Councilor Lewis, about auxiliary lanes, this other issue that we were trying to sharpen up and I think be more thoughtful about as we go forward on those kinds of improvements. So a lot of the projects that Kim is describing in that category are those auxiliary lanes. These are short highway expansions, interchange typically. What we work through with ODOT in those many meetings are a whole series of checkpoints before they go ahead and build those. They've agreed, in their comments they submitted to us, they've agreed to RTP language that commits them to all kinds of transparency that's not there today. So it doesn't mean that they won't build those. It does mean that we'll have a lot of opportunity to take a look at them and to ask questions about impacts on climate, safety, trade-offs, all those kinds of things. And it's using tools that already exist within ODOT in terms of their planning programs that they have not applied to those in the past. So I'm counting this as a win. If you go back to transparency and accountability, it is going to move these way more into the public discussion than they have been in the past. I think another part about it that didn't happen is that they did not come in to propose different projects in lieu of those. Their project list has stayed the same roughly as it was at the beginning of the call for projects. So I think that's another discussion for the policymakers to continue to have since there are other unmet needs on the ODOT system out there, including the orphan highways.
Great, thank you. And thank you for that context on auxiliary lanes being part of the project list as well as the policy. I guess I would just end kind of looking at the question about implementation. Really think it's important that we do that funding subcommittee for JPAC going into what's going to be a larger conversation that frankly at the state level gets dominated by cities and counties that don't keep urban standards. I also think it's important that we spend some resource and time bringing in guest speakers or panelists about VMT and best practices, not necessarily just rely on the Origo pilot. And then finally, we've also heard from community requests that we do either a subcommittee or work group on traffic violence. And I do think that that's important to bring to the regional level.
Great, thank you. Councilor Simpson.
Thank you, Councilor President, and thank you, JPAC Chair Gonzalez and Councilor Lewis for those comments. And I want to say thank you to Catherine and her staff, Tom as he leads TPAC, and Kim as she continues the engagement with community and various entities. It's very heartening to see so much feedback come back from community. I want to say we should continue to push on unbundling those projects out of ODOT and focusing in on those arterials and really promote those bike ped and transit projects. I think we hear that often over and over and over again. And I can tell you from my previous hat that I wore on the other side of the RTP, that has also been something that has continued to be a topic, considering we aren't keeping people safe on roads. And violence and fatalities around traffic continue to rise. And I totally agree 100% with Councilor Lewis's comments around tolling. We need more answers. We need to understand the impacts, good, bad, or neutral. And then also around transit and transportation. Again, I like the focus and strategy to make that a priority for the next one. I want to keep at that because that is oftentimes a concern I hear. Really, and I really want to lift up Councilor Lewis's comments. Like, we can't go anywhere without hearing about tolling or transit or keeping folks safe in the community. Really focusing in on how do we get better connectivity? How do we get folks to and from jobs and other places so that they can be a part of the socioeconomic wealth of the region? Again, I want to focus in on climate. I think, as we continue, we had a lovely.
Oh, you froze. We will wait.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're back.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. We don't have great Wi-Fi out here in East County. I do want to up.
Shoot.
Oh, he's completely dropped.
Am I not coming through?
Yep, now you are.
Okay, sorry. I want to continue to uplift climate at the forefront. I mean, I know we have big projects, freeway projects on the docket, but also there are other projects again that will help to create a more reliable and safe and a system with more travel options, so that we can begin to address those issues. And again, I really, really want to harp on the continued focus on a strategy for implementation, so that we aren't back spinning our wheels around the same projects over and over again. We get those things done and move forward.
Dang it. Counselor, are you there? Counselor? All right. I think we got most of his comments. We will also, there you are.
Okay. I'll wrap up. Based on staff summary, I believe we're working well to weave together the values and priorities of the region and council. And as we close this process, I'm prepared for the next round, so that we can get some really good projects targeted around how we invest in people and move people. I think that is the piece that we really need to work on, is centering people around all of this.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, we will head through the rest of the council now, because I think everybody wants to speak. Councilor Nolan, then Rosenthal, and then Huang.
Thanks, Madam President. Is it possible to get a split screen up there so we could have the set of questions, the slide with the set of questions that Catherine concluded with, side by side with this 5?
I will work on that. That will take at least
Okay.
a few minutes, though.
Okay. The reason I wanted that is that if I recall, and I'm not sure I recall exactly, your first question was about things we could do within the context of the 23 RTP that's been proposed to maximize climate and safety results. And I want to really emphasize that because I think it's really important. Climate, in simple terms, in my simple way of looking at it, but I think it's validated, is most significantly addressed by reducing VMT of internal combustion engines, reducing the exhaust from vehicles of any kind, and one way of reducing VMT is to improve the modal split with a higher participation on transit. Lots and lots of issues that my colleagues have already addressed around that, but I want to emphasize a couple of them. Any opportunity, and you'll have to educate me maybe offline about how this might play out, where we can identify funds that could be deployed for transit, and maybe a project isn't advancing because of some other kind of reason. something gets substituted into that place in the order, and the extent to which we can really emphasize that those somethings should look first to transit programs designed to increase ridership, which might be transit investments that address Councilor Lewis's concern about people's comfort, sense of safety, and willingness to use the transit system. I continue to believe we are collectively capable within this region of not just having a transit system people begrudgingly are willing to use, but they take pride in and prefer to use. We're not there today. Probably more of my constituents feel that way about their transit system and utilize it for a lot of historic reasons. But the extent to which we can get the entire region to that level of connection and comfort with their transit system is critical to our ability to reduce personal passenger vehicle VMT. Along those lines, I also would suggest that as we look at priority or policy number 3, we know very clearly from information we've shared in work sessions with the council and with JPAC together that we have woefully underinvested as a region in our transit system. We have a plan for the entire transportation system, and I don't know the numbers, but there's something like 90% there on funding the highway part of it, and 40 or 50% there on funding the transit system. I would submit that policy number 3 should be to increase regional transit funding. Because if we don't emphasize transit funding, we'll never close that gap. Highway funding is already, if not an order of magnitude, a multiple of what we invest in transit. And you're not ever going to catch transit up if it gets the lees of what's left over after we've invested in highways. Such a policy declaration would require a lot of work with our partners. I acknowledge that. State partners as well as local partners here in the region. But if we don't say that that's what it takes to be authentic about our climate policy, if we don't start having that challenging conversation, we'll continue to go down a path that gets us further from where we want to be and not closer. Finally, I want to echo and perhaps amplify some of the things that one of the suggestions Councilor Lewis made, and that is you talked about taking ownership and responsibility for electrification of the fleet. I 100% agree. I think it's a spot-on proposal. But I think we should move, perhaps this is a conversation for the 28 RTP, although the extent to which your magic wands can fit it into the current one, that would be great. Our RTP as a regional plan should rely on achieving our goals only on things we take some ownership in. I'd expand your idea beyond just electrification and charging stations. But if we're relying on a change in condition to achieve safety goals, to achieve reduction in congestion or increase in mobility, climate, it should be based on actions that the people who participate in the RTP can influence in a material way. And electrification, we don't set federal policy on fleet exhaust numbers, but we can say we want electrification of the fleet, so we are going to either require or fund charging stations at any housing development that we invest in. And in order to make it not a cost on the affordability, because that's our game in housing construction, find a way to fund it so that we expand the opportunities for people to charge. Charging at home or at work are the most successful places to do charging. So anything we can do to improve access to charging stations at homes or at places of work, using our regulatory or incentive authorities should fit into this plan. There's a lot more. You've already heard some of my comments in smaller discussions, but I wanted to highlight the ones here and thank my colleagues for the suggestions that they've made already.
Great, thank you. Councilor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to say I appreciate all the hard work and the robust process that staff has pursued. They've been easy to talk to. They've been willing to confer on things, and they've pursued it's been a very difficult process. I know there've been a lot of outreach and a lot of response. As they know, I've submitted rather copious quantities, so I can't comment on some of them until I read the public response sort of summary. But I do want to say a few things. I've said many times that a list of 1,000 projects does not constitute a vision, and I think two things have been pointed out here today fairly clearly, as Councilor Lewis and Councilor Nolan both noted. For example, a list of projects does not necessarily include the vision that we need to take some responsibility for electrification. The list of projects does not account for, and it's still true, Tiger does not support the Southwest Corridor because of the safety issue that they view as people coming out with problems that are going to cause problems in their city. None of those project lists will address these issues. These are the kinds of visions that we as Metro probably need to be a little bit more cognizant of. Now, maybe it doesn't have to be in the RTP, but it is something that we have to think about in terms of moving forward and coming up with an RTP or coming up with a vision for transportation in this area. Particularly safety and particularly climate. These are areas where you can't expect any particular mayor to have the larger perspective. A few of them will, some of them won't. They have their own local needs and they're going to deal with that. So I guess I would echo and support the comments that I've heard so far before, that perhaps we need to sit back and say, in an ideal world, what projects would we want to do? Would we want to take over some responsibility for electrification? Would we want to do more than just analyze the major projects for their impact on climate or safety? Would we want to engage in a policy that, and I'll take this from President Peterson, of trying to put roundabouts wherever we can in all the areas where we can where we have bad intersections. This is not something that an individual mayor is going to propose.
Teach drivers how to use them.
Pardon?
Teach drivers how to use them.
Yeah, well, just send them to Europe and have them drive Europe for a while and they'll figure it out.
I'll volunteer.
Not
Stop
England,
signs,
not
Portland.
England. Yeah, at any rate, so I think that's the substance of my comments, except that when it comes to tolling and pricing, I have to go back and I'll invoke what I was always told by one of my aunts is this: if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all.
About tolling.
About tolling and pricing, yes. And the way that we've gone about it, or the way that ODOT has gone about it. I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Huang.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Catherine, and all the staff for all your hard work on this. I know it's a lot of work, so thank you. I think it's been pretty clear about our interests are really in climate and safety, and I just want to reiterate that, but also ask a pointed question more around collaboration with the state and orphan highways. I didn't see that as kind of like really lifted up in any of the slides. But I'm really interested in how we can use the RTP to kind of help break the cycle of tragedy that we've seen on our orphan highways. And, like in 2021, there was a number of deaths on 82nd, and that really helped catalyze a conversation for that jurisdictional transfer. And then earlier this year, we had conversations on Powell, with other tragedies there as well. So I'm wondering how we can, use this process to help prime conversations for the 2025 lead session and beyond. And, it really shouldn't take fatalities on these highways to actually catalyze action. So like what can we do to help kind of continue those conversations that were started this year and really elevate the need for, jurisdictional transfer, orphan highways, and also, collaboration with, our federal partners and, the state. I think there's increasing interest in that. So yeah, hoping that they'll be uplifted a bit more in the RTP. And if you want to have any comments, that'd be helpful too.
Counselor, would you like me to
Sure.
provide some answers now, or was that guidance to?
Yeah, no, answers now would be helpful. Yeah.
I've actually been, as I'm listening to you all, writing some themes, which I will come back to at the end, but actually the very first one I wrote, because it's been reflected so clearly in so many of your comments, was elevate ODOT safety projects on arterials and orphan highways. I think there are ways that we can use some of JPAC's influence and authority and some of MPAC's influence and authority to, as we move between now and adoption in this RTP, to try to raise the priority of some of those. We've talked about that a little bit. I think Kim might be able to give us some more specificity on that offline. I also think very clearly, as we move into the next RTP, making sure our project selection process is very transparent and that we give very clear guidance on that type of project being important and build in some mechanisms to try to lift those up in priority. And as I'm hearing this, when I write notes, these notes I imagine being translated into staff recommendations on this. This isn't me just saying it back to you, but figuring out how we can concisely translate that into some active recommendations. And then the third thing that comes to mind is just continuing to really track and participate in an implementation setting in that conversation about jurisdictional transfer. So have Metro continue to be at the table, Metro staff tracking the conversations and helping work through some of the financial barriers to that type of transfer that are tending to be where they get tripped up right now, even when there's interest. So I think I'll leave it at that, but that gives you a flavor for what I'm thinking, and I'm happy to address more specifics if that feels like it didn't quite get to it.
No, I think that's the right, strategy. I just, like we often wait until it's too late in the session, and it's often catalyzed by tragedy where we can't move something because it was kind of came up. So like, how do we take proactive steps to have that conversation, and hopefully prevent those tragedies?
Yeah, thank you. We may be checking back with you about some specific ideas too, so thank you.
Counselors, thank you all for that input. I guess I would just take this another level up of what my theme of takeaway of listening to all of this is. We find ourselves in a position of having learned a lot since the last RTP. And knowing that there is more to do, but we are doing it in kind of a vacuum without the update of a 2040 plan to 2070. And we did that intentionally during COVID. We decided that nobody wanted to talk about a 50-year plan when they didn't know if they were going to have to wash their chip bag the next day. So I think it was the right decision to make, but it has left us in this vacuum of what is the vision of the region. And I know that that has been a conversation nonstop here, and that's why we have moved forward with the 5-year or 10-year strategic plan effort to put a framework around our budget and how we're working with our partners. So I guess I would just say the conversation I think the council needs to have next with our COO is how do we project out the work that needs to go into getting ready for, and then having a conversation around updating the 2040 to 2070 plan so that there is a better context, and use our 10-year strategic framework as a way to actually engage the implementation then of that once we actually get that. So I think those two things along will much better inform the next RTP and any issues we want to delve into along the way towards the next RTP. I would hate to sit on the laurels because I think we're finding ourselves in a transition moment. And I would hate to wait for the next RTP. I think the other thing to remember is that I look at this as a living document anyway, because that frickin' project list is really only active for the 5 years. But there are a lot of other projects to show how we're scheduling these things out. And there are, as the council so notes, once a week, I feel like we are making an MTIP amendment. Is it once a week? On average, maybe every other week. Chase, like maybe once a month, but it feels like more. So there is a lot of movement as we enter these conversations going into a legislative session, into how we need to move something forward faster because there's federal money. And I really appreciate that the staff in the region, the staff at Metro, even staff at ODOT are willing to engage and move things around, as long as they meet the requirements of the overall MTIP. So I think just in that terms, I am just going to say that I'm generally in agreement with the recommendations from staff with these caveats from the council. I would rather transportation funding be left transportation funding because there are bike and ped facilities that feed into our transit system that are roadway projects. So I hesitate to say it's just transit, but if we want to put transit and other things in parentheses, I don't have a problem with that. But I understand why the comment was made. So
If I might, the proposal is increasing.
yeah, no, I get it. I'm just saying I would want it for all of the tools that we have to make it a safer environment for everybody. So the general, that's my general, but I do think that we find ourselves in a lack of context at this point because the world has so changed. And so we somehow need to get these things back in sync and provide that opportunity for the region to have that larger conversation so that there is more ownership on the implementation of these pieces as we go along. So that would be my overall comment on the RTP that's not related to the RTP.
Thank you, Council President. Would you like me to summarize the
Yep,
key
that'd be
points of
perfect.
what I've taken away?
Madam
Happy to
President,
do
before
that.
you do that, may I add 2 comments? First, I wanted to acknowledge verbally the presentation you had in your slide about climate tools to expand how we analyze the impact of proposed investments and policies on climate. And just acknowledge that that was something that many of us brought to you. I have a particular interest, and you heard and incorporated that, and I appreciate it. The second comment is, when we talk about funding of any kind, we have to acknowledge, either through this instrument or elsewhere in our planning, that as we are successful in migrating away from petroleum-based fueling of the system, especially out of an exhaust pipe, into electricity as the fuel for mobility, it inherently, inevitably, and probably very quickly impacts how we fund the transportation system. We rely on gas taxes to support operations, maintenance, as well as back capital bonds, and yet we have a collective ambition to reduce that. So in all of our planning, but certainly in preparation for the 2028, we have to really push ODOT, or maybe we lead the conversation and involve ODOT in it. Yes, that's the way we should say that, into how we're going to fund transportation generally, because gas tax won't be the primary source within our lifetimes. Even my lifetime, I'm getting a little older than many of the folks here. Thanks, Madam President.
Yeah, and I would just amend that to say the electrical grid needs to be upgraded in order to accommodate all those, which is not necessarily a Metro authority, but it is a conversation for a 2070 problem that we're going to have to deal with. So All right, Catherine, summarize.
I will
Thanks.
just quickly share a few takeaways that we will incorporate into our staff recommendations based on this
Catherine,
conversation.
sorry to interrupt. I'm virtual with my hand raised. Sorry, I just
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes.
It's okay. It's okay. Just one last comment. I know that the screens are up, so the boxes don't always show, but I apologize for interrupting.
Oh, please.
I wanted to make one last small addition based off of everything I heard. On the safety piece, we did talk briefly. Councilor Lewis made some comments around the aspect of people feeling safe on transit is one of the elements that we haven't necessarily captured in terms of our safety framework and methodology. And when we talk about safety, we'll talk about the crashes, we'll talk about injuries. We have different metrics. But one of the things that I and I know others have been hearing really loud and clear from, especially users of transit, pedestrians, is the desire to feel safe, whether on transit, whether on others, and really making sure that our policy and our language reflects that, and then kind of finding ways to include investment and guidance for implementing partners to see that piece. So that and another thing that really stood out to me from my conversation with Counselor Simpson a few weeks ago, when we were talking about accessibility, in addition to really deepening our ADA focus and what it means for people to be able to access, is also this kind of the framework of achievability for transit. Like, is transit achievable? Not only is it accessible in terms of being reliable, and all of those things. So I just wanted to add two more things that were in the back of my mind, and just to help wrap up the conversation. But again, appreciate the opportunity to share some last thoughts, and I really hope that we're able to make some headway in that kind of personal safety feeling on transit, especially as we look to have our ridership recover pretty significantly here. All right, back to you.
Thank you.
Sorry. I just want to put an emphasis on what Councilor Gonzalez said, and that is we have to make sure our emphasis on safety is guided by our commitment to racial equity, because safety looks and feels different to me than it does to an immigrant family with young kids riding our transit. And I want to make sure that that's incorporated in what we say here.
All right,
Addition.
we're evidently not done. Counselor Rosenthal.
I just want to make one quick comment, and that I think we all have to realize that the pandemic changed everybody's vision of safety on transit. And Councilor Lewis is wearing a mask today. We all realize that it can be much more vulnerable, and that may require new techniques and new solutions that we haven't even really considered at this point in time. Years ago when I was in Kazakhstan, they said, don't take the transit because you'll get tuberculosis. So we didn't. That is a new world that we live in, and I think the RTP needs to recognize that in some sense. I'm not sure how.
Thank you.
One last call before the. Okay, seeing no hands raised. Go ahead, Catherine.
Thank you, President Peterson. This is not everything we heard. These guys, I'm sure, have captured this in more detail, but what I wanted to do is just hit high level on some of the themes that got echoed over and over, because I think they are really important to help us feel good about what moves into the adoption process. So we already talked about elevating ODOT safety projects on arterials and orphan highways, holding firm on the aux lane policy, improving tolling policies. We've heard that loud and clear and have been working with a number of you, and we'll bring back information to try to understand impacts and focus on the user experience and a regional approach. Electrification, raising the profile there, and both looking at ownership and leadership, ownership of the problem, not of the actual infrastructure. Focus on funding with specific emphasis on a JPACT work program to shift us toward alternative funding sources, recognizing all of the needs for that, and understanding also that that will be both a regional conversation and a state legislative conversation. looking at policies to set higher levels of investment, including multimodal and transit investment as guidance for project selection. And I think that just continues our trend of getting more and more transparent in the selection there. And an implementation focus on safety, both an implementation and a policy focus on safety that looks at traffic violence, but also separates out the related but important separate challenge of personal security in the transportation system, and the link there to racial equity. And then the accessibility question, I would like to circle back with Councilor Gonzalez and Councilor Simpson to make sure we understand exactly kind of what the direction is there. But those are the key takeaways. Please don't hesitate as we move forward to reach out to me and the team. If there are other things we missed, we'll also, I assure you, be reaching out to you all as we move through a number of council discussions on this in the next 2 months. So thank you so much for your engagement on this. And
Thank you. And just the last point on the accessibility piece, I think I've shared before, but I'm going to share it again because I want to make sure that we have a way to define it quantitatively as well as qualitatively, of moving just beyond, the accessibility definitions that we have used in the past, which are way better than anything that we ever had. So it's not a ding, it's just that we are learning and moving on. Is the work that Charles Brown has done around the different ways to measure justice. And so I would have shared the slide from his presentation that I saw, and the different types of justice and the different types of performance metrics that come off of those in transportation. Just so we have a way to talk about this as we move forward, that it is real, it is measurable, and this is what it means.
thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good job. All right,
Thank
thank
you
you,
so much.
everybody. Much appreciated. We look forward to seeing you at the next phase that's off the chart. Is that anyway, thank you, everybody.
And President Peterson, maybe I can just also thank the staff who have
Yep.
worked so hard on so many hours.
Great, thank you. And we will move on to our next agenda item, which is the Regional Waste Plan Outcomes and Council Priorities. Councilors, you'll remember that during the creation of the fiscal year, I'll just wait until we're done with the transition. During the creation of the fiscal year 23-24 budget, Council directed the Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Department to provide ongoing technical education on regional waste priorities to inform future council direction on the annual WPAS budget and regional waste fees. Today's work session is a part of the series of engagements with council this fall to provide additional context to support council decisions on the key projects, including the system's facilities plan and the development of the FY24 budget. Our first topic in the September series is the Regional Waste Plan. The plan provides policy guidance for advancing adopted regional waste goals, and it outlines responsibilities for cities, counties, and metro to collaboratively manage the regional waste system. I just want to highlight that the reason this is coming back is that none of us on this council were here when this was created. Some of us were here when it was adopted the week we came in. And we don't all have anywhere near, except maybe Councilor Gonzalez, who was on it as a citizen in the development. We all do not have a very deep background in the development of and what's actually in this plan in terms of what would be the priorities going forward. And the reason that's important is because of our conversations around the waste fees that we have and how what burden we are putting on the taxpayers, both in what services are not provided, how they're provided, as well as if we were to move forward to mitigate those issues, what burden that would put, again, on ratepayers going forward. So this is an opportunity for us to re-engage and understand more in depth what is in the plan. So thank you. We both have Marta McGuire, Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Director, and our Equity, Culture, and Engagement Manager, Rob Nathan.
Great, thank you so much. I'll just wait for the slide deck to come up. Thank you, Council President Peterson and councilors. We really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you today. And as Council President Peterson mentioned, this is the first of a series of engagements that we will be having with you. Next slide. So today's discussion will be focused on our department's role, the regional waste plan guidance, and key efforts that are underway. We'll cover the regional waste system, outcomes, and some of the progress to date. When we meet on Thursday, we will focus on Metro's role in the system, current levels of investment, and seek direction on future priorities. So today is a little bit presentation heavy, and I know you just went through a really long presentation, but really just to give some of that background on the plan development and guidance to set us up for a conversation on Thursday where we can step down into a deeper level of detail around where we are making current investments and where council priorities are for future investments. Next slide.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Marta, can you bring the mic just a
Closer
touch
to me?
closer, please? Thank you.
Thank you for noting that. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
First, I'm proud to represent the nearly 200 people who work in the Metro Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Department. We represent a really diverse portfolio of programs and services that support communities around the region. Next slide. Our primary responsibility is managing garbage, recycling, and household hazardous waste safely for people and businesses. Our work falls into 3 key areas that you see up here. Services and community investment that includes cleaning up garbage in the region, grants for local businesses, as well as providing information and education services. Planning and partnerships, so this is much of the work that we do with cities and counties around the region to reduce the impacts of products and waste through policy and regulation. And regional garbage and recycling operations, as you know, we own and operate 2 public transfer stations, household hazardous waste facilities, and the management of St. John's landfill. Next slide. The regional waste plan provides a framework for how Metro will work with partners in the region to prevent waste and protect people and the environment. Typically, the plan would address the reuse, recycling, and garbage services you see represented here. And traditionally, this is really where Metro has focused most of its efforts and investments and where we have the most regulatory authority. Next slide. The most recent 2030 Regional Waste Plan is unique, as it was designed to address the full life cycle of products that you see here. So that's including the design and manufacturing, consumption and use, in addition to end-of-life management. So prior to adoption, the state had adopted a new framework, the Materials Management Framework, which is focused on the life cycle of products. For Metro and Waste Prevention and Environmental Services, this follows through on our commitment to manage the garbage and recycling system safely for people, and it broadens the opportunity that we can take to reduce the impacts throughout the life cycle of a product through design and manufacturing, through use, and getting rid of it. Next slide. As Council President Peterson mentioned, the 2030 Regional Waste Plan is both a vision for Greater Portland to prevent and reduce waste and a blueprint for achieving that vision. Next slide. The plan serves as a guiding document for the work that Metro and local governments collectively do to manage the system. It provides specific guidance for the goals and actions to reduce the overall waste in the region and outlines roles and responsibility. It also meets our statutory requirement that we have a waste reduction plan in place. Next slide. This timeline shows the history of solid waste plans to date. There have been 3 plans to date. It was in 1987 that Metro first designated solid waste as an area for functional planning that directed the development of the first plan. Essentially, this designation recognizes the need to plan for the garbage and recycling system on a regional scale, much like our approach to regional land use and transportation planning, in which Metro serves as the regional planning authority for guiding the entire system as a whole. And we're going to talk a little bit more on Thursday about Metro's regulatory authority. Next slide. We took a phased approach to the development of the plan, starting with the values and moving to the vision, and then establishing goals and actions. During each phase, we engaged with community members, local government and industry partners, topical experts, as well as Metro's advisory bodies. The 2030 Regional Waste Plan was the first Metro plan to formally incorporate an equity lens into plan development, centering the voices and needs of communities that have historically not been included in decision-making. Next slide. In past processes, roles for input were primarily through the forms you see listed here, providing a moderate level of engagement, mostly from our local government partners and industry, but minimal engagement with community organizations and very limited input from communities of color and low-income communities. Our new approach for the 2030 Regional Waste Plan identified new forms of engagement, including an appointed equity work group, a community member cohort, and technical work groups. And I now want to turn it over to Rob Nathan, our Equity, Culture, and Engagement Manager, who's actually served on the equity work group prior to joining Metro.
Thanks, Marta, and thanks, Council, for giving us the opportunity to spend some time grounding us in the work and plan development. Next slide, please. As part of our equity lens, we created, or Metro created, an equity work group made up of representatives from organizations serving communities in our region, historically underserved in our region and identified as most impacted with regional system services. The goal of this group was to bring folks together to have an opportunity to work with staff throughout the plan development and to really provide a space at the table to inform decisions throughout each phase of the plan. Metro recruited individuals who had strong personal and professional backgrounds advocating for and advancing equity outcomes across our region. And when myself and those folks were at the table, we were committed to not just speaking for ourselves, but speaking for those we served on a daily basis. You know, I'm really.
How many now?
Yeah, you know, it's really.
Now are with us at Metro.
I can tell you, you know, it says a lot that 3 of the 7 dynamic individuals who served on this equity work group chose to serve here at Metro. I won't speak for the other ones because I'm sure there's lots of reasons why we come to work at this agency, but I will share with you a little bit about why I decided to join later. But regardless, it was an 18-month process, and it was extremely collaborative. It was a space where we had an opportunity to learn with Metro staff and for them to learn from us. And it was a very, very wonderful process to be a part of. Next slide, please. In addition to our equity work groups, we also, to further elevate the voices of community and those very individuals served by organizations like the ones that were at that table, we convened a community cohort, and it included a number of community-based organizations and the folks that they serve, which is here on that slide. And participants through that process, they joined us in touring facilities, getting opportunities to have experiences where they could understand what we're talking about with some of these really technical terms like putrescible waste. And it also gave us, and then we continued to do some community conversations, and it gave us an opportunity to really get at the benefits and the burdens that individuals and their communities face around our garbage system. The picture that you see there is an example of some of our community conversations. And next slide, please. So in addition to establishing a framework for decision making and a foundation of vision and values, Metro moved on and established some technical work groups where a number of our regional partners, including local governments, topical experts, private industry, had an opportunity to work together in a series of 8 groups with those topics that you see on the screen. And this was a point of the plan where we were taking the vision, the values, and the goals and developing actionable items with all of our regional partners, those who had historically not been included in decision-making and those who have historically been included. It was a wonderful process to see, and it was really great to see Metro staff commit to the lessons and priorities shared by community throughout that process. Next slide, please. I'm just going to ask Metro Council staff to advance these images every 10 seconds while I share some comments with you. So, these are snapshots of our, throughout our plan development. And, I'm going to take a step back because I said I was going to share with you what this process meant to me. But I think the fact that I've been here for 6 years serving the public as a Metro staff speaks for itself. And I'd rather share with you what it means to some of our partners, and particularly Trash for Peace, who I spoke with this week. And I asked them, what is the plan meant to you? And is it still something that's important to you? And this is what Laura Tokarski shared with me. She's the executive director of Trash for Peace. She says, being a part of the regional waste plan development was the first time we had ever participated in a government engagement process that actually works. Metro has kept its promises and continues to prioritize those historically left out of the conversation. Through a lasting partnership, we've been able to co-create community-based, peer-led, and peer-run programs, such as the Environmental Promoter Program, Ground Score Association, which is a waste picker collaborative, bulky waste programs, reuse and repair programs, and much more. Since this plan development, thousands of community members have been able to serve in our programs, and this is an example of government actually investing in what it says it wants to invest in, and it works. I'm still here today, and I continue to work at this agency because I believe those words that Laura shared with us. I'm going to pass it back to you, Marta.
Thank you. And I'm afraid our snapshots didn't work because we realize now it's a PDF document, not a PowerPoint. So we'll have to share some of those snapshots of that engagement with you by email. So thank you, Rob, so much for sharing that. I want to now just step into the plan itself. The plan has 6 elements that are listed here. As we mentioned, this plan was built piece by piece. We started with the values, with each part informing the next. The values, principles, and vision set the direction for the future and how decisions are made and prioritized. The goals set direction, and the actions outline specific steps to get to the goals. And lastly, the plan includes an approach to measure progress over time that's reflected in the plan indicators. And I now want to touch base on the specific plan guidance. So starting with the values that are listed here, they represent the foundation of the plan. The values were shaped through public surveys, forums convened by community organizations, the plan's equity work group, and the advisory committees that Rob just went through. And you'll see a direct connection between the plan values and the plan indicators that are used to measure progress. Next slide. One of the biggest surprises of the plan was the development of the principles. This wasn't originally a component of the plan, but it was something that our equity work group noted that was missing. These were authored by the equity work group. Rob helped contribute to these and became a foundational aspect that has guided plan development and further guides plan implementation. And I'll let Rob share a few words around this.
Yeah, our equity work group, while we extremely were supportive of the values that were brought forward and had an opportunity to provide input. We knew too often from partnering with government that oftentimes values statements can be subjective and up for interpretation. We really felt it was important to establish some objective statements. If you go to plan page 123 in the plan, you'll see in addition to these general plan principles, there's objective statements about what that means in practice. These are intended to serve as a guide and a tool for making decisions throughout plan implementation, and we also use these as a guide when we did the technical work groups with our regional partners developing actions. We kept coming back to these principles and talking about whether these actions spoke to those principles. And these principles align really well with Metro's strategic plan to advance racial equity. Thanks, Marta.
Yeah. Next slide. The goals in the plan are organized in the 5 distinct areas that are shown here, and the major organizing principle is the life cycle framework that you see in the middle of how we manage materials. The newest areas of emphasis in the plan include shared prosperity and disaster resilience. These weren't a part of past plans. Next slide. This is getting into the weeds a little bit, but I want to give you a sense of the mechanics of the plan when we refer to it as our blueprint. For each goal area, there is a set of actions to achieve the goals. This goal area is speaking to collection service requirements within cities and counties throughout the region. Actions that are tied to advancing racial equity are labeled with an E. So the equity work group went through an exercise using the plan principles to prioritize the actions within the plan that had the highest potential to advance racial equity. So that has helped prioritize how we were rolling out implementation of the plan. Each action is assigned a lead, so metro cities and counties are all. So when we think about this plan, it truly is a regional plan, and that cities are responsible in leading some actions while Metro is responsible in leading other actions, and this is outlined here. And again, this is also a part of our having a waste reduction plan for the region to meet statutory requirements. Actions are associated with a variety of implementation approaches, and we'll talk more about these on Thursday, but to give you a sense, the ones listed here related to consistent services for garbage and recycling, we implement through our regulatory arm, through code amendments that go through a legislative process, but there are other implementation approaches such as advocacy that we do at the legislative level, partnership agreements, work groups, grants, and through direct service programs. Next slide. When you take a step back, I was hearing the conversation around the vision for the region with the transportational plan. And for the regional waste plan, as you look at the plan as a whole, it really seeks to achieve 3 sets of desired outcomes that are listed here: shared prosperity, healthy environment, and excellent and accessible garbage and recycling system. And I want to briefly walk through these. Next slide, thank you. First, the outcomes related to advancing shared prosperity outcomes really differentiate this plan from past plans. As I noted, the shared prosperity goal area is a new addition. And it really focuses not only on improving jobs within the system, but the overall system economics and the distribution of benefits, and increasing opportunity and access for those most impacted. So some examples of actions in this area that may be familiar to you are adding new representation to expand the diversity of our advisory committees. Metro has taken action within this with our own formal advisory committee. Other cities and counties have also done that. Most recently, Washington County redid their advisory committee for the garbage and recycling system. In addition, we have advanced actions in this plan related to the temporary use of temporary workers and developing workforce transition programs. Next slide. The next set of outcomes falls within healthy environment, and these are the outcomes that speak to the life cycle framework that the plan uses. How do we not just recycle more, but get benefits from taking a wider variety of steps at all stages of the product life cycle? Actions in this area include much of our state legislative advocacy to address product design, phasing out of single-use products, and the delivery of waste prevention, education, and promoting better purchasing choices. Next slide. Lastly, we have great collection programs in the region, but they're not great for everyone. In particular, services to multifamily properties, those living in apartments, are inconsistent and inadequate. The plan directs actions to address this, as well as ensuring that we keep an adaptable system over time and are prepared in times of natural disaster. Really glad we had some of this plan in place before we had some of those disasters in recent years. Actions in this area include improving service standards for multifamily. I know this has been a priority for a number of you within this council, addressing the issue of bulky waste and implementing low-income rate assistance programs. So the low-income rate assistance programs is one that Councilor Nolan, you have mentioned before, and that's something that cities and counties have taken the lead on, working on implementation. Next slide. As the Regional Planning Authority, Metro is responsible for coordinating plan implementation, and so I just want to give you a high-level look at what that looks like. Next slide. The oversight framework includes 3 major components. Short-term work plans collaboratively developed with cities and counties stage the implementation of the plan over time, so it covers a decade plus. So we do about 3 to 5 year work plans in collaboration with city and county partners. I do feel like this is an area where we could have increased council guidance on what the priorities are, as this directly informs our annual budget. Reporting occurs on an annual basis, so that is both the progress report that we do annually that we shared in the packet. The last one was done in January and another one is in process. We also are required to report to the state on an annual basis on behalf of cities and counties on how we're meeting the waste reduction requirements in Oregon statute. Lastly, Metro Council and formal advisory committees provide guidance on plan implementation. Next slide. And this next slide just takes a little bit closer look at the oversight framework and the roles of the different committees that Metro holds to inform decisions and investments. I chair the Regional Waste Advisory Committee, which is made up of representatives from local governments, community, garbage and recycling users, and the solid waste industry that provide input on plan implementation. There is an opportunity for our council to chair this committee. At the time of plan adoption, it was designated to the Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Director. The Metro Policy Advisory Committee advises council on implementation of the actions that place direct requirements on local governments, and our Committee on Racial Equity provides input on the equity-related actions. So all of these committees providing recommendations and input to council to make final decisions. Next slide. As I noted that the plan was adopted in 2019 and we were just beginning plan implementation before the pandemic emerged. And I would say despite the pandemic, we've made significant progress as a result of the partnerships that we built within the plan that we were able to sustain and ever became more important during the times of the pandemic. I mentioned that the most recent report was done in January, and I just want to touch briefly on our progress to date. Next slide. And we can look at progress in two different ways. First is implementation of actions by goal area that are shown here. So thanks to the work of our partners and service providers, we have completed more than half the actions in the regional waste plan. They're either on track or completed. And also among the actions that are directly focused on advancing equity, nearly 2/3 of those are on track or completed. And those actions really focused on our efforts around culturally responsive education. Rob mentioned the Environmental Promoters Program, as well as equitable collection service standards. And I want to highlight two illustrations related to our work in these areas. Next slide. First is our work in multifamily service standards. This is one area that came up consistently in our conversations with communities around the region and resulted in specific actions for improvement. This year, we completed a key component of our multifamily service improvement project, which included the rollout and decal of more than 6,000 properties across the region. So one of the things we heard most is, it's confusing, I don't know what to recycle, all the posters, there's 17 different posters on my container. And so this was part of the effort to address that. And we worked closely with some of the community organizations that we met through plan development and also expanded upon that, and they helped us develop the language and signage itself and also helped us deploy the actual re-stickering and pulling off of old decals. Work continues this year with cities and counties to establish the minimum collection volume and frequency standards that are set for implementation in 2025, and this is working alongside the Bulky Waste Policy Project. Next slide. Second area just to highlight is our work in disaster resilience and convening cities and counties to prepare for natural disaster. We now have a regional work group that meets regularly to plan coordination for this. Metro, thanks to council, also established our disaster debris grant program that will be launching this fall, which will provide great support in times of disaster to our communities in the region. Next slide. The second way to evaluate progress is through our key indicators highlighted here. There are some indicators where we currently have baseline data and others where we are working to collect the data for future reporting cycles. I shared some of these key metrics as a part of my budget presentation in the spring, and we've made some progress in key areas, including youth reach through our education, living wage, and cleaning up dump garbage, but we have more work to do. Next slide. Next, I want to conclude with just touching on a few key projects underway that are helping advance progress toward the regional waste plan outcomes. The first one, which we've touched on with you before, is the Recycling Modernization Act that was adopted in 2022 and is aiming for implementation in 2025. Metro staff have been deeply engaged in the implementation of this act and bringing forward the goals identified in the regional waste plan, so there is direct alignment with that. Pam Peck, our policy and compliance director who is here today, serves on one of the recycling councils that is helping implement this act. It really helps advance the regional waste plan goals that are focused on expanding convenient public access to recycling, living wages, producer responsibility, and reducing contamination to better strengthen our markets. We are proposing a work session with council next month to dive deeper into the Recycling Modernization Act, the key funding opportunities that are coming through it, and the potential role for Metro in implementation. Next slide. The second key project is the System Facilities Plan. While the Regional Waste Plan provides the policy guidance, the System Facilities Plan will provide the long-range infrastructure plan and key investments needed to fulfill the Regional Waste Plan goals, including improving access to reuse, recycling, and garbage services. The plan is designed to provide options to council to decide the future infrastructure investments, and we'll be having a work session next week to review the work to date and present the updated scenarios prior to the symposium and stakeholder engagement workshop that we'll be having at the end of the month. Next slide. Lastly, as I have shared with you recently, we are taking a multi-pronged approach to the budget note that includes increased touch points with council this fall and winter to inform the budget development. We will convene a task force to make recommendations to Metro Council on solid waste fee policy, and this task force will be comprised of diverse stakeholders and convening this fall. Through both these processes, as well as the key projects underway, we seek to get further direction on council priorities for waste reduction. Next slide. So that concludes the presentation. We hope today to get some initial feedback or questions on the regional waste plan and specific outcomes we are working towards, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have. And again, on Thursday, we'll get a little bit more into detail, but we wanted to sort of set the stage with some background today.
Councilors, questions? Oh, I didn't see you. Councilor Lewis, thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. Really nice presentation, and definitely had to dig out some cobwebs from last time we did this, which I believe was January of 2019.
That is correct.
My memory's good, but not that.
I'm impressed.
I guess I have two things. The first will not surprise you, bulky waste. I would really like to dig in probably in your answer, but also on Thursday, on ways that we can do bulky waste at the neighborhood scale, looking at it probably in conjunction with the facilities work that's going on around depots, around reuse centers, and the nonprofit partners that do so much good work. But most areas that I'm aware of get served with 1 or 2 special collection events a year. And I'd really like to know what we're doing to increase that availability. Because when you gotta get rid of something, you gotta get rid of it. You're not gonna hold on to it for 6 months. So would love to hear a little bit more about the bulky waste work. And then my second question is the response to the budget note. Will there be council involvement beyond you engaging us as council? It was my belief when voting for that there would be members of council serving on the task force.
Great. Can I respond? Okay to respond now. So with the bulky waste, that's been a top priority. I'd love to dive into it more deeply on Thursday, but just to give you an initial response, this is something that we have been working on as a part of the improvements to the service standards, and it's really been structured in two phases. So when we think about bulky waste, there's services for single-family households, which vary across the region, the collection events that you refer to, as well as for multifamily properties and those living in apartments. And those services are likely going to look different just because of space availability. So in looking at implementation, we had prioritized multifamilies, looking at what is the adequate service for multifamily first. And we're currently in the phase of refining the collection pilots, so staging those pilots, programs to test different methods. So currently, I believe it's in Gresham, is that right, Pam? That we are hosting some events and picking out a day where everybody can put their waste out just to sort of test and see what that looks like, to then come to agreement with our jurisdictional partners around what does adequate bulky waste collection look like. The single family, we believe, might be a little bit easier, but has staged that as a second phase. However, I think there is the opportunity for council to have a discussion to see if there is a way that we can advance those on the same track. But it really does require a lot of collaboration and an agreement from our city and county partners. And so I think this would be a really good discussion for us to kind of dive into on Thursday, because we can also talk about what our regulatory authority is over that area. But absolutely, I agree with you, and it would be really helpful to get some additional council guidance in this area, along with a more detailed update.
Great, thanks.
And then with the budget note, the intention is to have 2 counselors serve on that committee.
Okay, great, thank you.
Councilor Rosenthal and Wong.
Thank you, Madam President. I have a couple questions, which we can answer Thursday or whatever. The first question would be, there was a chart that showed 0.5% of greenhouse gas emissions come during the recycling or reuse process. And I'd like a little bit more explanation of that chart, because it doesn't strike me as quite 0.5% seems awfully low. I mean, if we're spending a lot of effort dealing with the least important aspect of the whole chain. And a related question is, DEQ has come up with pretty much all the rules for the waste Waste Reduction Act. Why is it taking until July of 25, not July of 24, to really implement this? So that's a question. Then another question is on disaster. If we have a major subduction quake, the Columbia Gorge is going to be closed. And so what is our plan B for where does garbage go? Because we know it closes a couple times, and the problem we had a year before last when we had the ice storm. And then finally, should we have a value, or should we express a value about transparency? About what services are available, how the money is spent, how the money is allocated, and who is responsible. I get questions from clients and cities saying, we don't really understand who's on first and who's on second, sort of thing. So I'm just wondering if that's something that should be considered and put into our policies and values.
Great question. So let me see if I can go through those, and I might call on some support from our team. I did want to circle back, though, really quick to Councilor Lewis. In the interim, we do have the Regional Refresh Program that has been highly utilized by local government and community partners to help do bulky waste collection days. So that, as we're working on this, that's really become an investment that we've used to help provide that additional support in the in-between and been highly utilized. So I just wanted to make that note. Councilor Rosenthal, with regards to the greenhouse gas emissions, I believe you're referring to the economic or the environmental footprint within the regional waste plan, where it talks about 1% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from, when we look at the product life cycle, 1% comes from disposal. Right. And then I can't remember, 30 some, I should have brought the plan with me.
60% came from product
consumption,
production and development. 30% came from product usage, I guess.
Yep.
0.5% came from recycling and reuse or something. I wasn't sure I understood exactly what that chart was saying.
So it's based on the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's consumption-based greenhouse gas inventory. So that's really looking at where greenhouse gases are generated during the life of a material or product. And within that measure, the most greenhouse gas emissions are generated in that consumption portion of the life cycle. And so that's where we see we can have the greatest impact, which speaks to moving our efforts to focus on prevention or reuse and repair. I know Luis Sandoval, who's a principal planner on our analytics team, worked on that. Do you have anything to add? Is more of an expert in the greenhouse gas.
Yeah, sorry.
So I'll default to him.
Thank you, Luis.
It's a great question.
Thank you, Martha. Councilor Rosenthal, for the record, my name is Luis Sandoval. I am a planner in the Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Department. So the consumption-based emissions greenhouse gas inventory, and so it is looking at just the emissions emitted during, I believe that was the 2015 calendar year. And so it's usually the emissions associated with collecting garbage and recycling and turning them into, sorting them at MRVs. All those emissions are very, very small. Even the landfill emissions are very small compared to the emissions associated with making the products. So that's the point of that inventory. Now there's
So the point would be that to the extent you can take an extra 10% for reuse or repurposing, you're having a much more direct impact.
On your towards your climate goals, yes, we get greater impact in looking at how we can reduce consumption or reuse materials more so than what the greenhouse gases savings we would get in the disposal part, in the collection and processing and disposal of waste.
And the part that is not shown there is the avoided emissions that you get when you recycle or reuse something. So that's one way to address consumption-based emissions is through reuse. You can reduce consumption, you can by reusing, for example, or do source reduction like using less single use products. So what you don't see in an inventory, unfortunately, is the avoided emissions that you get from recycling and reusing products. That would be kind of a different exercise, a flow exercise where you take the net avoided, you do a greenhouse gas inventories and then calculate how much is avoided through recycling and reuse.
Has anybody nationally or internationally estimated what portion of production and consumption could actually be reduced? In other words, you take that big chart, the big part of the pie, and say, what portion of that could we actually bite into, so to speak? We're talking about pies.
Nationally,
I don't know if anybody's done that. I mean, I just.
With waste?
I think we look at it to see what piece of the pie. I would say it's interesting in some of the engagements that we've had recently with our reuse organizations, they hold that page up to us and say, this is the impact that we could have around your climate goals and really looking at how we can reuse and repair. Nationally, I'm...
It's a little difficult because these are emissions that are not just generated within the borders of the region or the state. These are looking at imported emissions through consumption, right? And so how do we reduce the manufacturing emissions associated with things built in other countries? We have very little influence over that except through our purchasing power and purchasing choices. We do have control over how much travel we do, for example, air travel, that goes into that too. We also have more control over how many times we upgrade a car. Do we buy a new car every 2 or 3 years? Those are the kinds of ways that you can reduce emissions from a sustainable materials management approach. And then reuse is a key element too that is more under Metro's sphere of influence, I would say.
And I'm glad that you said sphere of influence. I was going to mention that. One of the things that we did during plan development as we work with the technical work groups and identifying the actions is we did apply those spheres of control. Where is there an area of concern? Where is there an area that we can influence? Like we can influence consumption, but we don't have the authority to regulate it. And then where do we have authority? So that was really used as a screen as we looked at the actions and the goals of the plan. So only including those areas that we can actually influence and have authority over.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Luis. So the next question was relative to the Recycling Modernization Act, and Pam Peck, I mentioned, is serving on the advisory committee, and I think she can provide some additional detail on the implementation. I would say at a high level, implementing this act that is calling for really dramatic changes in our system around producer responsibility, around creating a uniform recycling list, around living wages, it just takes time to convene all those parties, but I don't know if there's anything you would add.
Yeah, good afternoon. It's nice to see everyone. My name is Pam Peck, and I'm the Policy and Compliance Program Director. Yes, Marta, I think, really gave a good high-level summary. So the bill was adopted in the 2021 legislative session. It went into effect in 2022. There's really significant rulemaking that the Department of Environmental Quality needs to do to really implement the bill. The first rulemaking process, which Metro participated in, was focused on what is on the list of things that will be collected, and there was a lot of analysis to ensure that there's actually a responsible end market for those places to go. So that's something we can talk about more when we come and talk with you about RMA, but the Environmental Quality Commission will be considering in November, they will adopt a uniform list for the state that every locality over a certain size will be required to collect, and every transfer station that has public services. There will also be another list of materials producers will be responsible for collecting, and we'll talk more about that. The current rulemaking that Warren Johnson is serving on the rulemaking committee is focused on standards for the facilities that sort our recyclables. So we have to be able to sort them to take advantage of good markets. So all of those processors have to be certified that they can meet the requirements of the new law by July of '25. Also, the producers who have new responsibilities have to develop their plans to meet all of their obligations under the law. So all these pieces kind of build on each other, because until you know what materials you're collecting, you really don't know all the other pieces of the puzzle. So there are many stakeholders who feel the process is actually too fast right now. And the state is looking at how to balance areas where there won't be a lot of initial change, like our area, we're collecting most of the items. In other parts of the state where there'll be big changes of expansion that may need a little bit more time. Yeah, the complexity and the number of changes are the main answer.
Thank you, Pam. And then your next question was around disaster preparedness and our contingencies, I believe, that we have in place for when roads shut down. Did I understand that correctly? So since we have encountered a number of incidents over the last several years, we have taken steps to put contingencies in place for when we do encounter those barriers. I don't have all that information with me here, but I am happy to provide it to you in a follow-up, if that sounds okay. And the last area that you mentioned was around rate transparency and rates. So there is goals and actions within the plan that specifically speak to transparency, communication to rate players, as well as having reasonable, consistent rates throughout the region. Since plan implementation, we have taken steps around notification and requirements for cities and counties to provide regular information to their residents. Another project that we're looking to bring forward to council consideration this fall is around rate transparency for our private transfer stations and looking at how do we meet that goal of reasonable, consistent rates. So this is a work session in October that we're looking at having. What would it look like to have a rate assessment done throughout the region to just get a sense of, we hear a lot from the private transfer stations around, you can't compare, it's apples and oranges. And between our transfer stations and cost of service and private transfer stations and their cost of service. So conducting a rate assessment will give us a sense of what is a reasonable cost of service, understanding that every facility has different variables depending on whether they're vertically integrated, on the types of services they provide. And a rate assessment is a common practice that is done around cities and counties that would help us better provide information and guidance on how we structure our rates. So there's more coming on that, but that is a goal that we've been working to and have taken steps towards implementation.
Thank you.
Hey, Councilor Wong.
Great. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Marta and Rob, for the great presentation. You can really see the evolution and growth in the work from, the plan in front of us from the previous plans. So kudos on that. I had a couple areas I wanted to tease out a little bit more. On the disaster resilience portion, does that include climate resilience as well? As our climate changes, are we incorporating and thinking about how that might impact, operations going forward? So just want to clarify if it's disaster resilience, is it just earthquake, or is it kind of more ongoing? And then, we've been on a real safety kick recently, and, from our visit to the zoo, this council really prioritized worker safety as well. And I see, some of our values are around, good pay and benefits in the industry. And I know, our staff and private companies have a high priority on safety, but I'm wondering if that's going to be a specific area to focus on. And, we see often communications about hazardous materials that cause, closures at our transfer stations or things like that. But how are we going to ensure the safety of our workforce, especially as we recruit kind of folks that are the most vulnerable? What proactive steps are we doing on that front?
I really appreciate that comment and question. I feel like it's never been more in front of us than what we've experienced, particularly as it relates to our frontline workers, not only working through a pandemic, but working through heat and ice events. I would say it absolutely is a value and a goal within the plan and with how we address our operations for Waste Prevention and Environmental Services. Some of the steps we have taken is establishing a new division that is focused on environmental stewardship and assets. We have Courtney Patterson, who's the program director for that, and who we were fortunate, who was also our emergency manager at Metro before. And in part, we really wanted her in that role to help provide that lens to the work that we do. And I think she can share some more on the climate resilience and disaster resilience work.
Yeah, thanks. For the record, Courtney Patterson, Asset Environmental Stewardship Division Director for WPES. So in your first question, if climate resilience is included in natural hazard resilience planning, it definitely is. I think that, we're seeing every day there's more heat events, there's more snow events, there's more rain events, there's more landslides. So doing that natural hazard planning, you really need to incorporate the climate change impacts that we're seeing and expect to see it more often. Should I answer the safety question too? On the safety question, definitely garbage and recycling is a dangerous industry. It is one of the top 5 most dangerous industries nationally. We were pretty proud of our safety record in WPES. We have a very low number of lost days, as well as many decades without a death at one of our facilities. So it's definitely something that we take pretty seriously and work on. WPES hired our own safety analyst at the start of 2022, and he is working diligently to incorporate job hazard analyses and health and safety plans for all of our operations, including the transfer stations. So it will take some time. As we brought the Metro Paint staff in as Metro employees, this is the first time that they're going through that. RID staff are also getting a comprehensive analysis of their safety risks. So we're actively working on that.
And I would say As a practice, we center our staff when we're looking at different incidents and events. Prior to the fires, I want to say right during COVID, we had never shut down our operations. And when it got to the point where we were in an evacuation zone and the air quality was bad, we had no choice. And as we look at our regional waste plan goals and values, that has become a practice, and looking at what are the temperatures that it's okay to curtail closures to keep our staff safe. So that is an ongoing practice that we've gotten. Carrie Stacy, who's the deputy director, leads the incident response in our operations, and we have learned a lot over the last couple of years and have better established practices to respond when there are weather-related events, and having processes to follow to ensure that we're taking the right measures, and if needed, curtailing our service hours in order to keep our staff safe.
Great. I'm glad it's all reflected in the work you're doing and maybe in the goals. If, under shared prosperity, it's not just about pay and benefits, but retention and safety as well. Great, thank you.
I just want to say one more thing too, that the capital projects are going to be really important. Our facilities, especially Metro South, are outdated. And so we're going to have a lot of closure days and a lot of lost work days as the climate changes if we're not able to modernize those facilities. So I think things that you'll be seeing through this process and the systems facilities plan are going to be really important for the safety of staff and then our continued service level.
Thanks, Courtney. Thank you. Before we go to Councilor Lewis, who had a follow-up, I just want to put an exclamation mark on how we go forward, and maybe Marta, you can follow up a little bit. But I think the plan, values, principles, a lot of the actions, I think if you did a poll of the counselors, 100% of 85 to 90% of the total items. But you know where I'm going. But I feel like the missing piece was in the implementation, it was in the weeds, right? It was the conversation around the systems facility plan. So trying to put all of this in context before we take on the big knotty issues of our time is that what were we prioritizing when we were talking about capital improvements, right? And were we maximizing for everything, or were we prioritizing some of these things? Because there's a difference about the practicality of moving forward with maximizing everything in our lists versus prioritizing what we need to do, for instance, that safety and security of our staff, as well as the public who come into our transfer stations. Maximizing for that might look different than maximizing for everything in our list. And so those are the scenarios you're going to be coming back with of what are we prioritizing and what could it look like for the future. And then the other piece of it to me that was missing in the context is how do you run a utility? And what the whole point to the transparency, I think Councilor Rosenthal's second piece on transparency that I picked up on was not just the rate conversation, but the who's in charge conversation, and the transparency of what does that mean in terms of our role within the management of the system. So I think those are the things that we are slowly working our way towards having that conversation of how in the overall scheme of things are we reducing waste going to the landfill? How are we doing these environmental things? How are we making sure that everybody can participate? Right. But we also have to run a utility and figure out how to balance these levers between what ratepayers are paying, what they're seeing on the ground, and what does that mean for our role in the region? And then does it actually end up reducing waste going to the landfill in the end? So just wanted to reemphasize why today's conversation is so important to remind ourselves. There's a lot in that plan, but the knottier parts of the implementation of the big pieces are where we're at right now. Councilor Lewis.
Sure, I just wanted to follow up on the rate assessment. It was my recollection in 2019 that we were dangerously close to being in rate assessment territory, and we had a contractor who was giving us charts that were like, here's this private transfer station, here's their, the things that we can learn from the outside, we can't go inside their black box. But we were kind of stuck because of lack of cooperation. So I guess in offering us that tool, how are things different now, or how would this approach to rate assessment not give us the same end result of there are things that we'll just never know about private facilities?
So just to give a little bit of background, I wish Brian Kennedy was here because he was directly involved in that process. You're correct that there were steps taken. To give a little bit of background, in 2016, the council at the time had adopted the transportation configuration policy, which reestablished direction for Metro to maintain public ownership of the transfer stations, to ensure a specific amount of tonnage flowing to those stations. The third part was around establishing a goal-based tonnage allocation program, which is our wet waste tonnage allocation program that is centered around the regional waste plan goals. And the fourth component of that policy was around rate transparency. And there were specific steps that were outlined for council action around getting to the rate transparency. The first step was around doing a model rate assessment to try and look at a mock-up. If you use pretend transfer stations, could you get to what the cost of service would be? And what was found that it didn't give us enough information because of the diversity of the private transfer stations to give us the information that we needed to understand what the cost of service was. So the next step was to do a more detailed rate assessment, actually working with the private transfer stations. And if I recall correctly, in general, you bring a consultant in to do it. It's co-created with the transfer stations. There is protection of private information in order to get to, here's the range of what it could cost from X to X for fees for service. And that is what we are proposing. At that point in time, the council did not take action to move to in 2019, to move to that next step. And then I think there was Brian could speak to this, a turnover at that point into a new council, I'm not sure. And then the pandemic. And so this is us bringing that back forward, because we heard consistently from cities and counties throughout the fee development of Metro what happened to this process. We're seeing a different distribution of rates among private transfer stations in the region. When we look at from lowest to highest, there is a range, and us, cities and counties, requesting that we move to this next step of rate assessment. So our plan is to bring a work session, or propose a work session for October, to give you the background on what I just shared at a more detailed level, and describe the components of the rate assessment, and to share more detailed concerns that local governments have shared with us.
Okay, great. So we have.
Because I think we talked about this a little bit before around the rate assessment.
So we have a specific October meeting just to focus on that piece?
Yeah, that's what we were requesting, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Councilors, we have 8 minutes left, and we have 2 more councilors that want to weigh in. Councilor Gonzalez, you haven't weighed in yet. Councilor Rosenthal, did you just put your hand down?
Well, if we have time, I'll put it back up.
And my hand, for some reason, isn't working anymore.
Oh.
Maybe you turned it off. Enough from her.
No, I have no control. Just to be clear, I have no control. There's good reason. No. Councilor Gonzalez, and then Councilor Nolan will wrap up. And then if we could keep communications at the end, either to or to this coming Thursday, or one word. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, cool.
Go ahead.
So I'll be really quick because my comments are high level in terms of the presentation. I hadn't had the opportunity to raise my hand, but I think that what really stands out to me as the most resounding successes of our policy shifts have been the focus on the multifamily kind of access, investment, stickers, and also the community education and pathways for entering the system, either through advocates for workforce. I've just been really, really impressed, and it takes a few years for things to materialize, but I see it, and I feel really proud of that. Also, I just want to acknowledge that, over the last few months with the rate setting conversation, as with either the tension, the discomfort, the feedback from our industry stakeholders, et cetera, whatever, the collection of all of those things, I think are a result of a major shift that we made in our policy to want to have different indicators in driving our decisions, and that's obviously sent shockwaves through the entire system. So I do want to kind of just acknowledge that that has happened because it was the direction that we gave, and remaining steadfast as we learn, and obviously making changes where it makes sense to accommodate for things we didn't know, but also as the council, for us to continue to I think it's important for us to continue to say, if we believe that we're heading in the right track, that these goals will continue to be our goals, that that it is important to affirm that, especially in a public setting, as considering the last few conversations we've had. So I'm here to say thumbs up, and I see the connection to that, and I'm open and want to continue leaning into those conversations. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Nolan.
3 quick points. On the transparency, I want to make sure we underscore that it is a transparency on both parts, all parts of the system. There are some black box elements to the way we look at the cost allocations or the costs of operating central and south. And especially in comparing our publicly owned facility operations with privately owned facility operations. I know you're aware of that. I just want to underscore it. And then I want to underscore also with the facilities program, we have an objective of reducing waste going to the landfill, and yet we have a system that relies on fees based on how much waste goes to the landfill. And how do we break that connection so that we're not under pressure to maintain the revenue in order to pay for more and more facilities? And the final point is, as we look at those new facilities, safety is certainly important, but the cost of investing in those is contained within waste WPES funds, but the way they're paid for by either businesses or landlords or homeowners is out of one pocket. So a business that is paying taxes to support Metro's supportive housing services program doesn't have multiple pockets, doesn't get more revenue to pay an increase in their WPES fees just because we need to expand our facilities. And so thinking about the economic impact of WPES increases on the people who are paying other Metro fees is something I'm particularly concerned about, especially from a progressive taxation point of view. The lower income families, the startup businesses, the locally owned businesses should be protected as we set up that system. Thanks, Madam President.
It parallels our last conversation in so many different ways of getting off the gas tax because we're not using that fuel anymore, but yet we're dependent on it. Yep.
Right.
All right. With that, thank you. Very much appreciate both of you coming forward and reminding us and talking about what's coming up next. So much appreciated. Melissa, any final comments from you on this?
No, I think just this is the first of many, and I think it was really important to us that we bring the working awareness of what's in the plan as we begin to guide you through a series of discussions where you'll be making decisions and giving us direction. And I just want to say, what I'm hearing is while we might be missing a few little things or want to emphasize, transparency or different things, that as a whole, these values resonate with you, and that these goals and actions resonate with you. And that is a super valuable consensus for us to have moving forward, because we're going to be going through a lot of actions in the near future. Thank you.
Counselor?
Just checking in. Thank you, Madam President. Does that statement imply that there's that you think there's council consensus on major facility construction in WPES?
No, it does not.
Okay, thanks.
No. We have a whole other process to get your consensus on that.
Yes. Yeah. All right. With that, I'm just going to go ahead and say we're adjourned. And we'll do Counselor communications and COO communications on Thursday. Thanks.